Further debate? The member for Carleton, Mississippi Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am here today to speak in support of Bill 122, an act to amend the Mental Health Act and the Healthcare Consent Act, 1996. Every day we here at Queen's Park wake up, perhaps have a cup of coffee, maybe a bit of breakfast. Some may head to the gym or even out for a jog. Others may delve into the newspaper or respond to emails while they wait for their day to begin. We congregate here every morning and stand before our supporters and protesters, strong and seemingly undaunted. Now imagine, if you will, not being capable of doing this. Imagine waking up in the morning and being immediately apprehensive about just getting out of bed. Imagine having every possible scenario of what could go wrong in your day enter your mind in a flood of overwhelming and crippling emotion. Are terrorists going to storm the legislature? Will we be bombed? Will there be another fire like there was in 1909? What about the commute over to the office? What if I get mugged on the subway? Then you begin to think of what could happen if you continued to stay in bed. Would the apartment catch fire? Could I be robbed? Are terrorists going to come to my dwelling? Will I be able to pay the rent this month if I don't go to work? Will I lose my job if I don't go to work? When and if you finally do get the courage to go outside, you begin to wonder, is everyone looking at me? I don't think that ticket booth person likes me. Which door should I go in? If I go in the west entrance, everyone could see me from their windows. The east entrance means a very long walk with people staring at me inside while I go to the West Tower elevator. Should I take the elevator? What if it malfunctions and I get stuck in it? These thoughts seem completely irrational and unbelievable to some, but for someone with a mild anxiety disorder, this is just a regular day. The feelings felt in this example are real and were given to me by a constituent of mine who suffers from a very mild form of anxiety. I cannot imagine starting every day like this, much less having it last all day, every day for a lifetime. Anxiety isn't always something that is programmed into your brain when you are born. It can be brought on by media and world events, personal encounters, or even traumatic brain injuries. As a result of an aneurysm, a person from my riding suffers tremendously. Not only does she have physical pain and noticeable cognitive and physical impairments from her trauma, she also has anxiety. She spends most of her days protected behind the four walls of her home. Going into public makes her feel naked and vulnerable. She excitedly makes plans to meet with family members months in advance, and when the time comes to follow through with these plans, the excitement subsides and debilitating fears consume her. Although they only live 30 minutes apart, she has not seen one of her sisters in over a year. She does not go shopping or attend family functions or visit with her daughter anymore like she used to. This woman was considered the lively, outgoing sibling in her family, and now she has become a hermit who is limited by a hidden illness. The symptoms of anxiety and those of depression can sometimes be confused. When you suffer from anxiety, you feel you struggle to do the things that most people do with relative ease every day. With depression, you may no longer be interested in participating in the things you were once capable of and enjoyed doing. A person with depression reveals their illness When a person with depression reveals their illness, the question they dread hearing most is, "What are you depressed about?" This is where education of mental illness is so important. A person who suffers from clinical depression rarely, if ever, has a say in what they are depressed about. Depression is very different from normal sadness in that it totally consumes your day-to-day life. It interferes with your ability to work, study, eat, sleep, and have fun. The feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, and worthlessness are intense and unrelenting, with little, if any, relief. Some have compared depression to being in an overwhelming rut that is so deep you feel you will never escape. The walls are tall, slick, and closing in on you. Sadness is not always a symptom of depression. For some men, in particular, anger, aggression, and restlessness are common signs of depression. Some begin to engage in unusual or reckless behavior, which may include excessive alcohol or drug abuse. A mental illness we recently hear about a lot, especially since the war in Afghanistan, is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Soldiers, police officers, firefighters, and paramedics are who we generally think of when we think of persons who experience this kind of mental illness due to the dramatic things they have witnessed in their lifetime. But really, any traumatic event can cause you to suffer from PTSD, as everyone copes differently with stress and traumatic events. Again, I will use examples from my own riding. A young man from one of our area school boards is a custodian on the night shift at a downtown Ottawa school. He stepped outside one spring evening to relax while on break from his shift. Moments later, he was attacked from behind, knocked to the ground, assaulted, had his wallet and cell phone stolen, and his glasses broken. This gentleman was from a small town on the west side of Ottawa. Just being downtown working was a fairly new experience for him, much less being assaulted and robbed while he was at work. After all, training to be a custodian in a school system doesn't exactly prepare you for the effects of being mugged. To go back to that school and surround himself with the same atmosphere and the possibility of it happening again was quite terrifying to him. But he did return to work, but only for a few days. With the encouragement of his friend and a co-worker, he approached his supervisor about the fear he felt with coming back to this location. After being evaluated by a board doctor and being diagnosed with PTSD and treated for a few weeks, the young man was sent to work at a different location while he continued to receive treatment. Thankfully for him, this option was available and he could continue to work. Luckily for this man, he noticed he had an issue, was diagnosed and treated. Too often, this is not the case for individuals who suffer from PTSD. Being attacked by a burglar or having been surrounded by a hail of gunfire are not always necessary to suffer from PTSD. This rang true for one of my constituency assistants one January evening in 2002 when her car was hit head-on by a sport utility vehicle while traveling home from work. Her lower leg was shattered and severed. Every bone in her face was broken and both jawbones fractured several times. One of those bones from her jaw protruded from her left cheek. She hung upside down, strapped to the seat for over an hour, before she was put into an ambulance, fully conscious, and rushed to the Ottawa Civic Hospital. While on the way to the hospital, her blood pressure dropped twice to the point that the paramedics thought they would lose her. Once at the hospital, she was in shock and had her superficial wounds stitched up and then placed in a medically induced coma for the next week while she underwent extensive surgeries. Her parents stated that after the accident, she knew what happened and even named the type of vehicle that had collided with her. Once she was allowed to awake from the coma, she knew nothing of the events that had taken place to put her in the hospital. Doctors say her brain blocked the trauma, and someday she may recall the accident, though to her dismay, she still has not to this day. After her accident, she had bad dreams and several flashbacks pertaining to the accident. The sound of glass breaking, of being swept off the floor, would make her heart race and cause her to nearly break into tears. She was diagnosed with PTSD. She was diagnosed early, treated, and now has minimal effects from PTSD, though she does still suffer from a mild traumatic brain injury. One of the most frighteningly named disorders under the mental illness umbrella is dissociative identity disorder, or multiple personality disorder. I was once told a story about a young person who, while they were in high school, battled depression and suicide. Guidance counselors, psychiatrists, and psychiatric hospital stays didn't seem to help the child, so she sort of fell by the wayside. She continued on, struggling her way into and through adulthood. She told stories to her friends of having brain tumors and a child no one had ever met. She would show up with bumps and bruises and slashes on her arms and legs. There were stories of abuse and groups of men attacking her and kidnapping her. She had friends on Facebook whom no one else knew, but would request friendships with a few of her friends and have Facebook friendships with them. Eventually, one of these mysterious people began to threaten the friends of the woman. Soon, the woman thankfully confided in her friend and told her she had been diagnosed with multiple personality disorder. The friend was relieved and now understood all the lies were not really lies. They were merely her illness acting out. The multiple Facebook accounts of random friends that were befriending and taunting her friends were actually accounts that the different personalities had set up. Unfortunately for this person, she will struggle for the rest of her life because there is no cure for this disorder. Mr. Speaker, mental illness affects more people in Canada than any other type of health problem. People suffer in so many different ways, from extreme and permanent mental illness to intermittent to recurring illness to occasional or even one-time troubles. Mental illness can include everything from severely criminally inclined schizophrenia to postpartum depression for new mothers, to lack of self-esteem driven depression in maturing teenagers, to chronic lifelong recurring depression, to one-time event-driven depression such as physical trauma, job loss, divorce, or death in a family. Depression in developing teenagers as they struggle with growing from a child to an adult can be traumatic and for some unbearable, with the tragic ending of suicide, which is devastating for families and communities. It is so terrible to see young lives lost. And for those that live with depression, so terrible to see the anguish, the suffering, and the sadness. So terrible to see the complete lack of joy and accomplishment. Depression can drive people to live on the streets and become street people, caught up in the vicious cycle of prostitution, drug and alcohol abuse, and crime. These are often young people from middle-class families, but they are trying to cope with mental illness, and they are not doing well. The Ottawa police chief said at a public meeting in Ottawa that 60% of policemen's time on streets is spent with mentally ill people. He said that we need more people properly trained in mental illness to work with mentally ill people on the street, that it would be better care, that policemen are not specifically trained in mental illness and therefore are not necessarily the best people to be on the streets with mentally ill people. Schizophrenia is a devastating disease. I know two sisters who are well educated and respected as experts in their field of work. They started and operated a successful not-for-profit business that was much used by many families, and they were successful at fundraising to keep the business going. The business was growing. Then they were both struck with schizophrenia. They imagined that their homes were being broken into, that there were spies, that there were people trying to hurt them or even kill them. Their lives were destroyed, and it was all in their head. There can be a seasonal depression from the short, dark days of winter. It is documented that in northern countries like Canada, there is more depression in winter than in summer because of our shorter winter days. Christmas time can be a depressing time for some people, especially people who are alone, people who are divorced or had a spouse die, had a parent or family member die, or are just alone at a time when everyone else seems to be happy and celebrating the festive season. Job loss and poverty can cause great anxiety and unhappiness, resulting in broken families and mental illness. Mental health can be a fragile thing and sometimes needs special attention to preserve and protect it. Mental illness affects many times more people than physical illness. Mental illness is a huge cost to employers because of the high cost of absenteeism on sick days. The total financial cost of mental health care in Ontario is about $15 billion per year. And the biggest cost of all is the cost of sadness and anguish to mentally ill people and their families. Living with mental illness is a courageous battle, as only the sufferer and possibly their families know the true agony they are in. So we must do better. We must do more. As a caring society, we have a moral obligation to help those who cannot help themselves. Mr. Speaker, our party supports this bill strongly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions and comments? The member for Kitchener-Waterloo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think that the theme here is that those personal stories resonate across all ridings, and they actually anchor the need for us to actually move forward with progressive legislation. Now, it's true, though, that this piece, Bill 122, the Mental Health Statute Law Amendment Act of 2015, is quite narrow, and it amends a specific, it is, of course, we're debating it because the court has ordered us to do so. But the general theme is that we are recognizing the need to balance public safety concerns with the need to properly protect the rights of patients. This case, though, Mr. Speaker, was brought forward by the appellant, a mental health patient who was initially sentenced to a 45-month criminal sentence for sexual assault against a child, which was completed back in 1996 and has subsequently been involuntarily committed to a maximum security mental health institution since then for the last 19 years. 19 years, Mr. Speaker. Now, the appellant also, in this instance, and this was the the motivator for this court case, is also deaf and has only had limited and sporadic access to interpreters throughout his 19-year confinement, inhibiting treatment. And what has actually happened is that the Capacity and the Consent Board has reviewed the appellant's involuntary detention on a yearly basis. They have concluded that he does not belong in a maximum security facility. But the reason why this legislation is on the floor of this legislature today is because the Capacity and Consent Board has no powers, Mr. Speaker, to do the right thing for this particular individual. Now, this individual obviously has other diagnoses, multiple diagnoses. The member actually referenced the complexity of cases such as this. But we have a duty in this House to ensure that the legislation and the law is working for all Ontarians, regardless of how they came to be in these circumstances. The broader issue of mental health in the province of Ontario, the Act is open. We should take the opportunity to address the long-standing systemic issues that pertain to mental health in the province of Ontario. Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Questions and comments? The member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is truly a pleasure to rise today and speak to Bill 122, the Mental Health Act. I've been thinking about it as I've been listening to the many comments here today, and in particular the MPP for Carleton, Mississippi Mills. I want to thank you for your heartfelt comments, and one thing that comes to me is that every one of the members in this legislature has experienced constituents who have had difficulties with mental health issues. There's nothing that's more despairing than that when you're trying to help and you're sometimes challenged to find solutions. In my riding of Kingston and the Islands, I had a mental health town hall. It was absolutely packed. And at that time, in the spring, in April of this year, I decided to create a task force or an advocacy group to look at the various different aspects of mental health care in my community. We have many program providers that are extremely good at what they do, but as has been stated, sometimes we don't always collaborate the best we can with each other, or we're not aware of a particular program that a service provider has in our riding. So the amendments would, if passed, ensure that the Mental Health Act would align with the Charter and at the same time enhance the rights of involuntary long-term patients who have been committed to psychiatric facilities. I think that this is extremely important. Every Ontarian should enjoy good and the best possible mental health and well-being throughout their lives. And Ontarians with mental health or addictions can recover and participate in welcoming, supportive communities. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you very much. Questions and comments? The member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to commend the member from Carleton, Mississippi Mills on the remarks that he made and went through a number of different life-changing events that people can experience and then learn to live with if they're fortunate enough to get the right care, the right treatment, the right medication. But there's many people, as a number of people have said here today, who do fall through the cracks and are unable to receive that treatment. Earlier today, it reminded me when I was listening to the member for Carleton, Mississippi Mills, and others speaking. I didn't read it closely enough to look at tonight, but I had an email from my office earlier this afternoon when we were going to debate this, and it talked about more funding is going to be provided by the local LHIN in Sarnia-Lambton, and a lot of it's going to be directed towards handling mental health cases because it's been recognized. I think it's going to be a leading edge funding in our riding that they're going to take a look at, and hopefully it'll be able to help other people in other parts of the province as we administer this. As we said earlier, this is one of the our caucus supports this fully. We question, why it's taken this long to get to here, but we are here now. Irregardless, we're here. And last week's Health Quality Ontario's annual report highlighted the unfortunate reality that hospital readmission rates for patients with mental illness or addiction have not improved in 5 years, and that the suicide rates have not improved in a decade. So we need to do better for our most vulnerable people. We need to work also, Mr. Speaker, to combat the stigma, which a number of speakers have dwelled upon, that's associated with mental health, and start talking about what and how we can provide greater access to the treatment that each and every one of our fellow citizens deserve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Questions and comments? The member for Welland.
Well, thank you, Speaker. Now, I know that this bill is in place to try and balance public safety concerns versus kind of charter rights and the court order for individuals who are currently being detained, I think 338 of them across the province. But no, I haven't heard anyone speak about the violence that actually occurs in psychiatric hospitals. On psychiatric units in our hospitals across the province. And I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to watch the program this week. I think it was on Saturday evening on Marketplace, and it talked about the number of nurses, RNs, RPNs that are being assaulted in our hospitals, severely assaulted in some cases, broken jaws, and I hazard a guess that many of these assaults are happening on psychiatric units. Being a nurse and representing nurses for over 40 years, it is common for staff to be assaulted on psychiatric units. Part of that is, so there's an imbalance there as well, making sure that when we're looking after patients with mental health issues, that there are enough staff in place on units all the time, not just during those working hours, but during breaks, lunch breaks and coffee breaks, to make sure that nurses and psychiatric workers in our hospitals are safe, and that they can go home at the end of the day to their families without being injured, in some cases dead. Now, I know that there were 760 cases in Ontario alone over a 6-year period, and only 3 charges laid in those 760 cases by the Ministry of Labour. So something more certainly needs to be done on that aspect as well.
Thank you very much. The member for Carleton, Mississippi Mills has 2 minutes to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the members from Kitchener-Waterloo, Kingston and the Islands, Sarnia-Lambton and Welland for their comments. It's wonderful to be part of a debate where we are all in agreement. The member from Kingston and the Islands having a town hall meeting, I think that's wonderful. It's a great idea, something we should probably all copy and do, because I'm sure we could all fill the town hall, because every community, I'm sure, has almost exactly the same problem. I had the privilege of sitting on a select committee here about 1.5 years ago for developmentally disabled, which was a learning experience, a very poignant time. And the reason I got onto that, because parents come into my office with parents of autistic children, and they told me what it was like in their homes, and they told me how little we do to help them with developmentally disabled intellectual problems. Then during our travels, we heard many people speak to the committee, and they talked about dual diagnosis, which is having autism or fetal alcohol syndrome or one of these other troubles, plus mental illness, which would be a consequence of having these other terrible afflictions. Which those would be very complicated things to deal with, because they already have a huge problem with their other ailments. So mental illness is one of those things which has been very much neglected in almost every respect, work-wise, attention-wise, funding-wise, and certainly that committee, which I was very proud to be part of that, the first page said all the care that is needed should be mandated. Imagine if you ever had a broken leg or a heart attack and you went to the hospital and they said, we ran out of broken leg money, go home and good luck, which is what we do for developmentally disabled and very often for mentally ill people. Thank you very much, Speaker.